Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so today we're looking at something that seems pretty clear-cut on the surface.
Right.
This Supreme Court ruling, Mahmoud v. Taylor, you hear about it, and it sounds like, a win for parental rights.
That's the main narrative, yeah. Letting families opt their kids out of certain classroom content if they object.
Seems reasonable enough, but the analysis we're looking at suggests there's a whole other layer here.
Oh, definitely. A really significant one. It goes way beyond just what kids are learning.
That's what we want to unpack. How this ruling might actually be reshaping who gets to learn together, who's even allowed to be visible in our schools.
It's impacting who teaches, too. It's quite profound, potentially.
A quiet earthquake, you might say, for public education in the U.S.
That's a good way to put it.
So for this deep dive, we're drawing on some really insightful work by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks and also research from Casale Ginola and others from 2023.
And there's a classroom example we can use, too, a visual one we'll describe.
Right, to make it tangible. Our goal here is really to unpack how this ruling is shifting things, maybe in ways people aren't noticing.
And what we might lose if we're not paying attention.
Exactly. What it means for you and how you understand what's happening in education today.
Okay.
So let's start with that surface level again. Mahmoud v. Taylor, it reaffirms parental rights to opt out of content. That's the basic idea, right?
That's the basic idea, yes.
Yeah.
But the critical nuance, according to the analysis, is how incredibly broad the definition of content becomes under this ruling.
Broader than just books or lessons.
Much broader. It's not just about ideas or materials anymore. It effectively allows objections to who is teaching,
Wow.
who wrote the curriculum, who gets named in it, and, sort of by quiet extension, who is even allowed to be seen or acknowledged within the school environment.
So it's not just about the what, but the who.
Precisely. The identities present in the classroom become potential content to object to.
Okay, that immediately feels different. And the analysis suggests this isn't just a one-off case.
No, the argument is that it provides a legal and, importantly, a rhetorical tool, a way for districts to retreat from inclusion efforts.
And not just concerning, say, LGBTQ plus topics or authors, which often get headlines.
Right. It extends further. The analysis points specifically to disabled learners, especially those whose communication or behavior might be seen as, different or challenging.
How so?
Because the presence and participation of anyone deemed potentially controversial by some can now be framed as objectionable content. The analysis calls this a systematic, calculated rollback.
A rollback from what, exactly? From the idea of inclusion?
Yes, from genuine inclusion. It fosters what the source calls quiet compliance.
Quiet compliance. What does that mean in practice?
It means schools can technically follow the letter of the law, like an Individualized Education Program, an IEP for a disabled student. They check the boxes.
Okay.
But at the same time, they can abandon the broader ethical commitment behind inclusion, the actual spirit of it.
The spirit of shared learning, learning together.
Exactly. That vision gets subtly reframed. Suddenly, having diverse learners truly participating together might be seen as too risky, too divisive, too likely to attract objections.
So the focus shifts from shared community to avoiding trouble.
Pretty much. Compliance over connection.
Okay, this feels like a good point to clarify. What do we actually mean by inclusion here? It's clearly more than just a buzzword in this context.
Absolutely. And the research from Casale Ginola and their colleagues is really helpful here. They emphasize that inclusion isn't just a physical placement.
Not just putting a student with an IEP in a general ed classroom.
Right. That's just logistics. True inclusion is a pedagogical commitment. It's about intentionally structuring the learning environment, the teaching, the relationships.
How so?
So that all students are seen as rightful, valued participants. It's rooted in relationality and making meaning together.
And the idea isn't that difference is something to be managed, but something that actually adds value.
Exactly. The research argues that learning is deepened, not diminished, by neurocognitive differences, by different ways of communicating. It makes the classroom richer.
So that implies deliberate actions, right? Things schools need to do.
Yes, intentional design. Things like effective co-teaching models where general and special educators collaborate closely.
Universal design for learning principles.
Precisely. UDL, building flexibility in from the start. Also, peer supports, and crucially, curricula that actually reflect the lives and languages of all the students in the room.
Not just a dominant group.
Right, and the benefits, according to this research, are really clear and tangible.
Okay, like what?
Well, for students with IEPs, Genuine inclusion leads to better academic results, better social skills, more independence down the line.
They build stronger relationships with peers.
Yes, and they get meaningful exposure to the grade level curriculum and just being part of the community authentically.
And what about the non-disabled peers? Is there a benefit for them too?
Absolutely. The research shows it fosters empathy, improves collaborative problem-solving skills. They gain a much more realistic and nuanced understanding of diversity. It's not an abstract concept anymore.
So it prepares everyone better for the real world.
You could say that, yes. It creates a more dynamic and beneficial learning space for everyone involved.
Which brings us back to that key distinction the analysis makes. Inclusion is not the same as just implementing an IEP.
Critically important. You can follow an IEP perfectly, meet all the technical requirements, and still have a student who is completely isolated, who doesn't feel like they belong.
So it's about participation, actual presence with meaning.
Yes, not just presence on paper. And that's the ground that seems to be shifting after Mahmoud v. Taylor.
How so? How does the ruling enable this shift away from that meaningful presence?
Well, the legal landscape changes. The ruling doesn't explicitly forbid inclusion, nothing that blunt.
Okay.
But it empowers districts to withdraw from it. It gives them a justification, often framed as neutrality or respecting parental choice.
Which sounds reasonable on the surface.
Exactly. But the effect is a withdrawal from the harder, more complex work of building truly inclusive spaces.
And you mentioned a chilling effect. What does that look like?
It means risk-averse districts, fearing lawsuits, will likely start stripping classrooms of anything potentially divisive. Books, lessons.
But the analysis says it goes further than materials.
Yes, and this is the really disturbing part. They start treating people's specific students, specific teachers, as sources of controversy themselves. Their identities become the problem.
Can you give us that classroom example you mentioned earlier to make this concrete?
Yes, the source uses a powerful example. Picture a pre-calculus whiteboard.
Okay.
It's covered in carefully constructed notes, maybe color-coded diagrams explaining amplitude, phase shift, the unit circle. You can almost see the teacher's effort, the real-time work of making complex math accessible.
Right, good teaching scaffolds.
Exactly. Now, apply the Mahmoud lens. Let's say the teacher who created this amazing scaffold, who is doing this effective teaching, is, well, the source uses the example of a neuroqueer trans woman.
Okay.
Suddenly, her very presence, her body, her voice, the way she explains things that can be framed by objecting parents as queer content. The pedagogy itself, the act of teaching calculus inclusively, gets reframed as pushing an ideology.
Just because of who the teacher is?
Yes. The teacher's identity contaminates the content in the eyes of those objecting.
Wow. That's incredibly chilling. What are the practical consequences then if schools start thinking like this?
Well, the analysis predicts a move towards segregation by default. Meaning co-teaching, where different kids learn together with multiple teachers supporting them, becomes seen as too politically volatile.
So pull-out programs become the norm again.
It becomes the safer, easier administrative option. An administrator might just say, look, just fulfill the IEP requirements, keep things quiet, don't cause a stir.
Compliance over inclusion.
Right. And you'll see increased scrutiny, not just of books, but of teachers' identities, maybe even teaching methods like those whiteboard scaffolds, if they're seen as too individualized, too responsive, not standardized enough.
And pressure on educators
A
themselves.
huge pressure, especially on those whose identities are deemed contentious. They might feel pushed out or implicitly told to sort of mask themselves, be less visible, less authentic.
Which defeats the whole purpose of having diverse role models.
Completely. And inclusion itself gets downgraded. It's no longer seen as fundamental pedagogy, but maybe as an optional extra.
Like an enrichment program.
Yeah, something nice to have, but easily cut when budgets get tight or political winds shift. It leads to what the analysis starkly calls technical compliance without relationship, without care, without truth.
Just going through the motions.
Exactly. Meeting the letter of the law, but losing the soul of education.
And the analysis connects this specific ruling to a much bigger picture, doesn't it?
It does. Dr. Hoerricks argues this isn't happening in a vacuum. It's seen as one more tool in a long-term strategy.
A strategy to do what?
To undermine, fragment, and ultimately, the argument goes, replace public education as a shared universal good.
Okay, the source delves into the political context here, which we should touch on carefully. It describes the political landscape in the U.S. And suggests, impartially reporting here, that both major political factions have played a role, perhaps in different ways in what it calls the hollowing out of public education. Can you elaborate on how the analysis presents that?
Sure. The source posits that the U.S. has, effectively, two right-wing parties with different approaches. One is described as pursuing oligarchic interests via technocratic containment, using management techniques, standardization, data to control and limit public systems.
Okay.
The other is described as pursuing authoritarian goals with open reactionary hostility, a more direct, ideologically driven attack on public institutions. The analysis argues, though, that both trajectories, despite their different styles, have contributed to weakening public education.
And Mahmoud v. Taylor fits into this by providing a specific legal tool.
Yes, a powerful mechanism for what the analysis calls selective withdrawal. It allows individuals or groups to opt out of the shared public system piece by piece under the banner of parental rights.
So it allows individual objections, often framed religiously or ideologically, to essentially override the secular public nature of the school.
That's the core argument. It forces the public system to bend to individual objections in a way that fragments the shared experience.
The source mentions an example from California.
Yes, referencing the Los Angeles Times.
Yeah.
California has laws, like SB 48, mandating the inclusion of contributions from LGBTQ plus people, disabled people, people of color in the curriculum.
Okay, those laws are still on the books.
Technically, yes, but the Mahmoud ruling acts like a scalpel. The opt-out provision can be used to meticulously carve away these required lessons, family by family, district by district.
Until what's left isn't really public anymore.
Exactly. If everyone opts out at different pieces, what shared understanding remains? The curriculum becomes broken, fragmented.
And this puts school districts in an impossible position.
Completely. Caught between state mandates requiring inclusion and court-backed parental objections demanding exclusion. They're set up to look dysfunctional.
But the analysis says this isn't accidental dysfunction.
No, the argument is that it's dysfunction by design. It makes public schools appear broken, not because they're inherently failing, but because they're being actively sabotaged.
Which then raises the crucial question, cui bono, who benefits from this perceived chaos?
And the analysis points directly towards alternatives to traditional public schools. Charter networks, private academies, religious schools.
Why them specifically?
Well, they often operate under different rules. They may be exempt from the same diversity mandates, they often serve fewer students with significant disabilities, and they typically don't have unionized teachers. They could be presented as the smoother, less controversial solution.
So the chaos in public schools potentially drives enrollment and funding towards these alternatives.
That's the dynamic the analysis describes.
The source uses a really stark term here, educational redlining. What does that mean in this context?
It suggests we're moving beyond sorting kids, just by neighborhood or test scores. Now, students might be sorted based on whether their families or the school administration reacting to families are willing to tolerate the presence and acknowledgement of diverse identities.
Sorting based on tolerance for others.
It's a powerful and troubling idea, who you're willing to share a classroom with, or whose identity you find acceptable.
And the crucial follow-up question is, who gets left behind in this sorting process?
And the analysis is unambiguous. It's the students who are consistently targeted in these cultural battles.
Disabled students.
Yes, queer students, Black and brown students, multilingual learners, students whose very existence, whose identities or ways of being are framed as inherently political or controversial.
Their lives become the objectionable content.
That's the danger highlighted in the analysis.
So, wrapping this up, thinking about the listener, what's the big takeaway here? This deep dive suggests that Mahmoud v. Taylor, while seeming small, touches something really fundamental.
It really does. What's at stake is the future of shared education in a diverse, pluralistic society. It's about whether public schools can remain spaces where different people learn from and with each other.
That vision of inclusion as pedagogy we talked about earlier.
From Casale Ginola and colleagues. Yes. That vision of school built on interdependence, access, shared growth, that's what's imperiled.
And they're warning about just focusing on IEP compliance.
It's not theoretical anymore. This ruling provides a legal pathway to do exactly that, comply on paper while eroding the actual practice of belonging.
So Dr. Hoerricks' analysis calls for us to, pay attention, name what's happening.
Yes, to recognize that just following the law isn't a neutral act when the law itself can be used to facilitate quiet erasure and exclusion. We need to see the mechanisms at play.
And the source leaves us with a final, really provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
It asks us to consider the ultimate cost. It says, and this is a direct quote, "Once we accept that any child's humanity can be opted out of, we have already abandoned the promise of the classroom."
Abandon the promise of the classroom.
Yeah. And the cost isn't just in lawsuits or budget cuts. The analysis says it's measured in all the futures we will have quietly foreclosed.
Futures foreclosed. It really forces you to think about what kind of society we're building or perhaps dismantling through these seemingly small shifts in educational policy.
What kind of public spaces do we want? What does it mean to learn together? Those are the questions left hanging.
A lot to think about. Thank you for breaking that down.
Thank you.